Once, a single kingdom ruled lands so vast that the sun never dared to set upon it. Gold flowed into Spain like a river without end. Yet beneath the glory, something was already breaking. This is the entire history of the Spanish Empire, the story of how Spain conquered the world and how the world quietly destroyed Spain. Chapter 1. Forged in faith and fire. Spain was not born as a nation. It was forged, slowly, violently, and relentlessly, in fire and faith. For centuries, the land we now call Spain was a fractured frontier. The Iberian Peninsula was a crossroads of empires, languages, and beliefs. In the year 711, Muslim armies from North Africa crossed the narrow Strait of Gibraltar and swept across the peninsula with astonishing speed. Within a few years, the Visigothic kingdom collapsed, and Al-Andalus was born, an Islamic civilization that would rule much of Iberia for nearly 800 years. Under Muslim rule, cities like Córdoba became centers of learning, science, and architecture. Libraries flourished, roads were built, trade connected Iberia to North Africa and the Middle East. But while Al-Andalus thrived in the south, resistance quietly survived in the northern mountains. Small Christian kingdoms, Asturias, Leon, Castile, Navarre, and Aragon, refused to disappear. What followed was not a single war, but a centuries-long struggle known as the Reconquista. It was not only a fight for land, but for identity. Generation after generation was raised with the belief that reclaiming Iberia was a sacred mission. War became tradition. Faith became justification. Violence became normal. This long conflict shaped Spain's character before Spain even existed. As the centuries passed, Christian kingdoms slowly pushed south. Cities fell, borders shifted, and populations were displaced. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived together uneasily at times, peacefully at others, but the balance was fragile. By the late 15th century, only one Muslim stronghold remained, the Emirate of Granada. Then came the union that changed everything. In 1469, Isabella of Castile married Ferdinand of Aragon. It was not a romantic alliance. It was a strategic fusion of power. Together, their kingdoms controlled most of Christian Iberia. With a shared crown and a shared faith, they pursued unity with absolute determination. Religion became the glue and the weapon. In 1492, Granada fell. The Reconquista was complete. For the first time in centuries, nearly the entire peninsula was under Christian rule. But unity came at a cost. Spain did not simply conquer territory, it sought purity. Muslims were forced to convert, flee, or die. Jews, who had lived in Iberia for generations, were expelled or hunted by the Inquisition. Faith was no longer personal. It was enforced. This moment mattered more than it seemed. Spain emerged not as a tolerant kingdom, but as a militant, centralized religious state. Authority flowed from the crown. Obedience flowed from belief. Questioning was dangerous. Conformity was survival. And then, almost quietly, the horizon opened. That same year, 1492, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus approached the Spanish crown with an impossible idea: reach Asia by sailing west. Other kingdoms had refused him. Spain did not. Why? Because Spain was a nation forged in conquest. Risk was familiar, expansion felt natural, and faith had already taught its rulers that destiny could be claimed by force. When Columbus set sail, Spain was not yet an empire. It had no global vision, no blueprint for domination, but it possessed something just as powerful: a mindset shaped by centuries of holy war. Spain had learned to conquer before it learned to govern. It had learned to destroy before it learned to build. The Reconquista did not end in 1492. It simply changed direction. The fires that once burned across Iberia would soon ignite continents beyond the sea, and the empire that would follow would carry those flames with it, everywhere it went. Chapter 2, 1492. The year the world opened. History rarely turns on a single year, but 1492 was different. For Spain, it was not merely a date on a calendar, it was a rupture in time. In that year, a newly unified kingdom stepped beyond the limits of Europe and into a world it did not yet understand. What followed would reshape continents, destroy civilizations, and give birth to the first global empire in human history. When Christopher Columbus sailed west under the Spanish crown, he was not searching for a new world. He was chasing an old one. Asia, its spices, its wealth, its trade routes. Spain itself had no clear imperial ambition. It was exhausted from centuries of war, drained by the Reconquista, and desperate to compete with Portugal, which already dominated sea routes around Africa. But Spain made a decision that others hesitated to make. It gambled. Columbus's voyage was driven by faith as much as navigation. The ships were small, the maps were wrong, the risks were enormous. Yet when land appeared on the horizon in October 1492, Spain unknowingly crossed a threshold that could never be reversed. The world had opened, but only for those strong enough to take it. At first, the discoveries seemed modest. Islands, strange people, exotic plants. But beneath the surface lay something far more dangerous. Unclaimed wealth on a scale Europe had never imagined. Gold was present, not in rivers yet, but in stories, ornaments, whispers. Spain listened. What followed was not exploration. It was acceleration. Within decades, Spanish expeditions pushed deeper into the Americas. Conquistadors, soldiers, fortune-seekers, and believers arrived with steel, horses, and gunpowder. They faced civilizations that were vast, organized, and sophisticated, yet vulnerable to forces they had never encountered before. Disease arrived first. Smallpox, measles, and influenza moved faster than armies. Entire communities collapsed before Spanish forces even reached them. What looked like military superiority was often biological catastrophe. Then came conquest. Hernán Cortés marched into the Aztec Empire with a few hundred men and toppled a civilization of millions. Francisco Pizarro did the same to the Inca Empire, capturing an emperor in a single ambush. These victories were not just feats of warfare, they were collapses of worlds. Spain did not merely defeat empires, it replaced them. The Spanish crown moved quickly to claim what it had found. Lands were divided, peoples were classified, systems of forced labor, most notably the encomienda, were imposed. Indigenous populations were converted, exploited, and controlled in the name of God and crown. But above all else, Spain extracted. Silver poured from the mines of Mexico and Peru. The mountain of Potosi became one of the most productive silver sources in history. Ships crossed the Atlantic heavy with treasure, feeding Europe's hunger for wealth. Spain was suddenly rich beyond imagination. Yet this wealth came with a hidden cost. Spain did not build factories. It did not invest in innovation. It did not develop a diversified economy. Instead, it imported goods, paid mercenaries, and financed wars. Gold and silver flowed in and flowed straight back out. 1492 had opened the world, but it also opened a trap. Spain's empire expanded faster than its institutions. Administration struggled to keep pace with conquest. Corruption flourished. Distance weakened control. The empire was vast but fragile. And still, Spain pressed forward, because in the early years, success masked every warning sign. The oceans belonged to Spain. The New World bent under its flag. Faith justified violence. Gold silenced doubt. In 1492, Spain had stepped into history. It did not yet realize that history would one day demand everything in return. Chapter 3. Empires of Gold, Empires of Blood. The Spanish Empire did not rise on land alone. It rose on gold and blood, and the two were never separated. By the early 16th century, Spain's presence in the Americas had hardened from exploration into domination. What began as scattered expeditions transformed into a machinery of conquest, designed to extract wealth at any human cost. Entire civilizations were pulled into this system, not as partners, but as fuel. The conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires had sent a clear message across the Atlantic. Unimaginable riches lay waiting. But wealth on this scale required structure, control, and labor. Spain provided all three. The crown claimed ownership over newly conquered lands, granting authority to colonial governors, viceroys, and military commanders. In theory, Spain ruled through law. In practice, it ruled through force. Indigenous societies were dismantled and reorganized around Spanish needs. At the center of this system stood the encomienda. Under this arrangement, Spanish settlers were granted control over indigenous communities. In return for protection and Christian instruction, natives were forced to work, mining silver, farming land, and building colonial cities. It was not slavery by name, but it functioned as slavery in reality. Abuse was widespread, mortality was staggering, and still, Spain demanded more. Silver became the lifeblood of the empire. In the Andes, the discovery of the Potosi mine changed global history. Entire mountains were carved open. Indigenous men were conscripted through the Mita labor system, dragged from their villages to work in lethal conditions. Mercury poisoning, tunnel collapses, exhaustion. Death was constant, but the silver kept flowing. By the mid-1500s, Spanish silver was circulating across Europe, the Ottoman Empire, India, and China. For the first time, the world was economically connected. Spain stood at the center of this system, not as a producer, but as a conduit. Gold and silver did not make Spain strong. They made Spain dependent. As indigenous populations collapsed, decimated by disease, overwork, and violence, Spain turned to another solution: enslaved Africans. The transatlantic slave trade expanded rapidly under Spanish demand. Human beings were transported as cargo, sold to sustain an empire that devoured lives as easily as it consumed metal. This was not chaos, it was policy. Religion provided the justification, conversion offered moral cover. The Spanish crown and church presented conquest as salvation, extraction as civilization. The sword and the cross moved together. Resistance was heresy. Submission was survival. Yet even within Spain, voices of warning emerged. Figures like Bartolomé de las Casas documented atrocities and pleaded for reform. Debates erupted in royal courts over the humanity of indigenous peoples. Laws were written, restrictions were announced, but enforcement faded in the distance between Madrid and the New World. Profit always traveled faster than justice. Colonial cities rose. Mexico City, Lima, Havana, built atop ruins of older civilizations. Spanish architecture dominated the skyline, while indigenous cultures were pushed to the margins or erased entirely. Languages vanished. Histories were rewritten. The empire reshaped memory itself, and still the illusion held. Spain appeared unstoppable. Its ships crossed oceans unchallenged. Its treasuries overflowed. Its enemies watched with fear and envy. But beneath the surface, the empire was hollowing itself out. Spain exported raw wealth and imported finished goods. It rewarded conquest, not craftsmanship. It relied on forced labor rather than innovation. The empire's foundation was vast, but unstable. Empires built on blood rarely notice the cost until the bleeding begins at home. The Spanish Empire believed gold would secure its future. Instead, it financed its undoing. Chapter 4. The sun never set, but it began to fade. By the mid-16th century, Spain stood at the height of human power. Its territories stretched across Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. From Mexico to Peru, from Naples to the Netherlands, from the Caribbean to the Philippines, Spanish banners flew over lands separated by oceans and time zones. It was said that the sun never set on the Spanish Empire, because somewhere, at every hour, Spain ruled. But empires rarely fall at their peak. They begin to decay while still wearing their crown. Under Charles I and his son, Philip II, Spain became the defender of Catholic Europe. The crown saw itself not merely as a political authority, but as a divine instrument. Spain would fight heresy wherever it appeared. Faith became foreign policy. That decision would drain the empire. Spain fought wars on every front, in Italy against France, in Central Europe against Protestant princes, in the Mediterranean against the Ottoman Empire, in the Netherlands against rebellion and resistance. Each conflict demanded soldiers, ships, and silver, and Spain paid for all of it with American wealth. For a time, it worked. Spanish infantry became legendary. The tercios dominated European battlefields. Spain's navy controlled key trade routes. Madrid transformed into the capital of a global empire. Art and culture flourished during Spain's golden age, with painters, poets, and architects leaving behind monuments of brilliance. But behind the splendor, the structure was cracking. Spain's economy was built on extraction, not production. While rivals like England and the Dutch Republic invested in shipbuilding, commerce, and finance, Spain relied on silver shipments to fund everything. Inflation soared. Prices rose faster than wages. Local industries collapsed under the pressure of cheap imports. Silver made Spain rich, but it made its rivals stronger. Nowhere was this more evident than at sea. In 1588, Spain launched the Spanish Armada, a massive fleet intended to crush Protestant England and restore Catholic rule. It was a display of imperial confidence, almost arrogance. But the seas did not obey faith or tradition. The Armada failed. Storms scattered the fleet. English ships outmaneuvered Spanish galleons. What was meant to be a decisive victory became a humiliating disaster. Spain did not lose its empire that year, but it lost something far more important: the illusion of invincibility. From that moment on, challengers multiplied. The Dutch continued their revolt, fueled by trade and innovation. English privateers attacked Spanish shipping with increasing success. France watched and waited. Spain's enemies learned a crucial lesson: the empire could be wounded, and the wounds kept coming. Endless wars drained the treasury. Spain declared bankruptcy multiple times, not because it lacked wealth, but because it had already spent it. American silver arrived only to be immediately claimed by creditors, mercenaries, and foreign suppliers. At home, the rigid social structure worsened the crisis. Nobility despised commerce. Labor was devalued. Productivity stagnated. The empire conquered the world, but failed to cultivate itself. The sun still shone on Spanish lands across the globe, but its warmth was fading. What remained was an empire stretched thin, fighting yesterday's wars with yesterday's ideas. Spain clung to faith and tradition, while the world shifted toward capitalism, industry, and modern statecraft. The empire had reached its zenith. From here on, every victory would cost more than it returned, and every sunset would last just a little longer. Chapter 5. Silver without strength. Spain possessed what every empire desired: limitless wealth. What it lacked was the ability to turn that wealth into lasting power. By the 17th century, silver continued to arrive from the Americas in staggering quantities. Galleons crossed the Atlantic heavy with treasure, guarded by fleets and prayers. On paper, Spain remained the richest state in Europe. In reality, it was quietly becoming one of the weakest. The problem was not shortage, it was structure. Spain had built an empire that consumed wealth but never multiplied it. Silver financed wars, paid foreign bankers, and purchased goods manufactured elsewhere. Spain imported weapons from Italy, textiles from Flanders, ships from Northern Europe. Its economy functioned like a funnel. Wealth entered, then immediately drained away. Inflation ravaged daily life. Prices soared while wages stagnated. Farmers abandoned land. Artisans closed workshops. Cities filled with unemployed men who sought honor in titles rather than productivity. Labor was despised. Nobility was worshipped. An empire that ruled the world refused to work within it. The crown responded not with reform, but with repetition. More silver was demanded. More colonies were squeezed. More taxes were imposed. Each solution deepened the crisis it was meant to solve. Spain declared bankruptcy repeatedly, not because its mines were empty, but because its obligations were endless. Creditors in Genoa, Antwerp, and later Amsterdam dictated terms. Spain's empire increasingly existed to service debt rather than to secure prosperity. Meanwhile, the world moved on. The Dutch built financial institutions. England developed naval capitalism. France centralized administration. These rising powers learned to extract value not from land alone, but from trade, industry, and innovation. Spain did not. Its leadership clung to tradition, faith, and hierarchy. Economic change was viewed with suspicion. Protestants traded, Catholics prayed. While rivals adapted, Spain preserved an imperial image long after its foundations had weakened. The consequences were visible everywhere. The Netherlands broke away, becoming a commercial powerhouse. Portugal slipped from Spanish control. Italy became a burden rather than a prize. Even Spain's own countryside fell into decline as infrastructure crumbled and productivity collapsed. And yet, the empire remained vast. This was Spain's great illusion. Size replaced strength. Territory replaced capacity. The empire looked powerful because it was everywhere, but it was nowhere efficient. Silver had bought obedience abroad, but it had eroded discipline at home. Colonial administrators grew corrupt. Smuggling flourished. Control weakened with distance. Spain ruled lands it could no longer effectively manage, protect, or profit from. The empire began to bleed, not from invasion, but from exhaustion. By the late 1600s, Spain was no longer shaping the world. It was reacting to it. Decisions were slow. Reforms were timid. Each crisis was met with borrowed money and borrowed time. Silver continued to arrive, but it no longer mattered. Wealth without industry is temporary. Power without adaptation is fragile. Spain had mastered conquest, but it had failed at sustainability. The empire was not collapsing yet, but its strength had already been spent. Chapter 6. The Quiet Death of a Global Empire. By the 18th century, the Spanish Empire had entered its final chapter, a slow, quiet death rather than a dramatic collapse. The sun that once never set over its vast dominions now cast shadows over weakened institutions, stagnant economies, and restless colonies. Spain still ruled lands across the globe, but its power had become hollow, its influence waning, and its glory fading into history. Spain's troubles were many, and they were intertwined. Centuries of wealth extraction had left the empire dependent on American silver, yet its administration remained inefficient. Corruption flourished among colonial governors, viceroys, and local officials. Distance made oversight nearly impossible. Messages that once took months to cross the Atlantic now determined the fates of entire kingdoms, often too late. Wealth continued to flow, but it enriched a few while leaving the empire fragile and divided. Meanwhile, Europe had changed. France, Britain, and the Dutch Republic had built economies that were adaptable, innovative, and industrializing. Spain remained anchored in feudal structures and religious orthodoxy. Wars continued, sometimes for survival, often for pride. But Spain increasingly fought with borrowed money, outdated tactics, and exhausted manpower. Battles were no longer the sources of glory. They were expensive reminders of decline. The first shock came from within. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain, placing his brother Joseph on the throne. The Spanish people rebelled in what became the Peninsular War, a brutal, chaotic struggle that drained resources and exposed the weakness of Spain's military. French occupation undermined authority, creating confusion in colonies thousands of miles away. Spain's empire, already stretched thin, was vulnerable to the very subjects it claimed to govern. Across the Atlantic, independence movements ignited. The revolutions of Latin America were fueled by local elites, inspired by Enlightenment ideals, and frustrated by colonial exploitation. Leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín rallied armies to challenge Spanish rule. Between 1810 and 1825, almost all of Spain's American colonies declared independence. Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, Argentina, and more. The empire that had crossed oceans and toppled empires now lost lands it had conquered with relative ease centuries earlier. Spain's final humiliation came in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. The empire, weakened and outdated, faced the rising power of the United States. Defeat was swift. Spain lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, territories that had been pillars of its overseas empire. For the first time in centuries, Spain's global influence was reduced to a handful of colonies and an exhausted reputation. Yet the empire did not die with fanfare or flames. Its collapse was quiet, gradual, and almost unnoticed by the wider world. Spain retained a cultural legacy, language, and institutions, but the political and economic power that had once reshaped the globe was gone. Where once silver had flowed like rivers and armies marched unchallenged, now Spain was left to reckon with history. The quiet death of the Spanish Empire offers a lesson in inevitability. Empires that rely solely on conquest, wealth extraction, and tradition cannot endure indefinitely. They are vulnerable to innovation, rebellion, and change. Spain conquered the world with faith, fire, and ambition, but it could not govern it with foresight, adaptability, or discipline. By the end of the 19th century, Spain had become a shadow of its former self. The world had shifted, empires had risen and fallen, and Spain's golden age was firmly in the past. Its story is not one of sudden collapse or dramatic defeat, but of a long, inexorable fading, a testament to the fragile nature of even the greatest dominions. The sun that once never set on Spain now sank quietly into history, leaving behind lessons of ambition, conquest, and the ultimate cost of glory. If you want to uncover more empires, secrets, and stories that shaped our world, subscribe now and step into the shadows of history with Midnight Empire.